Hello, everybody. My name is Luis Linneo, and I work at the Men Engage Europe Secretariat. We are actually doing this together with the Men Engage Global Alliance. We have this really beautiful panel that's going to talk about the angry young men and the misogynistic and populistic backlash in Europe. So you all very welcome to this session. I see we're getting into the high numbers of 58 participants, and I think by the end of this we'll probably be up to 100, I hope. So yes, I'm not gonna talk too much, and I have to introduce my first guests, but I'm just gonna tell you that this is also part of the membership meeting that the Men Engage Europe Alliance is having right now. And so Dave, you can actually put the camera off right now, just for a second, and then yes. We have David also is a part of the Men Engage Europe Alliance. You're going to hear from him a bit later. And we are having a membership meeting. And this is also something that our members have been discussing for a long time. And we are eager to learn more, and we are eager to know what we can do about this backlash that we see in the whole world, but also in Europe. So yeah, so without further ado, I would like to introduce my friends now and colleagues from Denmark, Christian Mugensen, please, and Stine, are you with us? You can put on your camera now. Yeah, there you are. You're both together. Great. So yes, please. Yeah. I'll giving the floor to you now. Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Hi everyone. Thank you, Louise. I'm Stine Helding-Rand. I'm here with my colleague Christian Mogensen, who will be talking to you in a little while. I'm a psychologist and he's a specialist consultant, and we both work at Center for Digital Youth Care in Denmark, where we work with all things digital and youth related. For the past 2.5 years, we've been focusing on the angry internet and the angry young men who populate it. So that's what we're going to spend the next hour or so talking to you guys about. So first off, last year we did a huge investigation for the Nordic Council of Ministers here in Denmark when they had when they were in charge of the Nordic Council of Ministers, and we wanted to figure out how many Nordic young men are angry on the internet, how many express misogynistic views, how many are a part of these communities. So what we did, we analyzed over 100,000 posts, comments, tweets, and retweets from Twitter and from Reddit and from 4chan. We wanted to look at 8kun, we wanted to look at several different other platforms, Facebook, but we had to choose, seeing as we only had 1 year to do this and only had limited funds, we had to choose only 3 platforms. So we chose Twitter and Reddit and 4chan, seeing as we all 3 platforms are really are renowned for a lot of misogynistic content. What we found was there's as of last year, there was up to 850 active Nordic authors on these platforms who were posting misogynistic content. We couldn't find, we didn't see any delimited systemic movement that couldn't be traced, meaning that it's not like there's this group who are figuring out that they want to change the world, they want to do this stuff, they're doing it together like a community, but we see these as individuals, and it's up to 850 active Nordic authors. There's no indication of immediate threat, meaning that they aren't gathered together and planning to overthrow the world or planning to make attacks on anyone or anything at the moment. But it's important to know that this is just a picture of how it looked when we had analyzed all these things. Things could look different now. But at the moment when we did that, we couldn't see any indication of immediate threat, and we couldn't see any systemic movement. So I would like to tell you a bit about the psychological structures of being a part of the angry internet, and Christian will be talking more about the social structures and the environment and the culture online. So it goes for all human beings that sociality trumps morality, meaning that it's more important for us to be part of something bigger, be part of a group, be social, having our social needs met, more than it is important to adhere to our own moral values. So as human beings, we're actually willing to set aside our own morality if it means having a place to be and having a place to belong, having a group to be a part of. This is due to this need to belong that every human being has. We all need to be part of something. We all need to have a place to call home, to have something that is ours, to be part of a family, be part of a group, be part of something, so we aren't on our own, seeing as we are social beings. Everyone also needs to feel significant in some way or other, feel that other people want to be with them, feel that other people are interested in them, we all need to feel some sort of identity, and we all need to feel that other people are interested in us and want to know who we are and see us as important and see us as an important part of their social relationships. And if we look at it on a personal level, so we have this whole social level where we all need to be part of something bigger. We need to be part of these groups. But if we look at it at a personal level, groups can also offer many answers to many of the questions in life we have. So everybody asks themselves every once in a while, who am I? Who am I? Where am I going? Who do I want to be? Where should I go in life? What direction should I take? What do I want to do with my life? What kind of an education do I want? What kind of life do I want for myself? Do I want kids? Do I want a family? What do I want to do? All these questions are natural questions that we ask ourselves. Also, what is the meaning of life? Why am I here? What do I want to do? What do I want to get out of this time I have? And for many of the men in question on the angry internet, there's also often the question of, why am I so miserable? Because as we can see, as far as we can tell from spending a lot of time on the angry internet and talking to these young men, many of them, most of them are miserable. It shows as an anger. When they turn out and towards the world, it's anger that goes to show it's the only acceptable emotion for them. It's just anger we see on the outside, but actually it stems from a miserableness and from a sadness and from an underlying vulnerability. So they ask themselves, why am I so miserable when everybody else is happy? Why can everybody else be happy when I'm so miserable? And this isn't fair. And this part about this isn't fair is actually what makes many of these young men tick, and what is actually what's going on for many of them. They have this innate sense of something is wrong. I have been wronged, and this isn't fair. I shouldn't be feeling this way. I shouldn't have this sense of unfairness. So it starts as a state of vulnerability and a state of feeling wronged. Many of these young men, we often mistake them as being just very angry and being just privileged white kids who don't understand that there needs to be a space for everybody in the world. But actually, when we dig a little bit deeper and talk to these young men, when we see who they actually are, we can see it's actually a question of them being very vulnerable. And this underlying vulnerability and the feeling wrong is what makes them seek out these communities online. Because they feel this and think, well, what can I do? And for many men, as goes for most men, they're really bad at asking for help. There's this stereotype of men having to just be able to deal with their own problems, be able to just man up when faced with obstacles in life and just get over it. So this also creates a taboo around asking for help. So many men don't ask for help. And if they do, they seek the help where it isn't seen, meaning in this case, the digital communities. They often go online if they need help from others, because it's more safe to do it online. Safe in the sense that you can actually tell everybody about your vulnerabilities, about your sadness, about all these issues you have in life, and still get to save face. You don't have to tell anybody who you actually are. You don't have to come to face with anybody and show them your sadness and your vulnerability. You can do it within the safe space of your own room and behind your own computer and behind your own screen. So it's a more safe way to show your vulnerability when you go online. Furthermore, many men feel very insecure about the current challenge of the traditional masculinity ideal. They are at a loss as to how am I supposed to be a man, because I can no longer be a man in the traditional way, because that's not good at the moment. But then what am I supposed to be? Because this is the only thing I know. This can also oppose them to seek these digital communities, because within the digital communities, they can find quite simple answers to these pretty complex questions. So many of them seek out these platforms, both the ones we investigated last year, but also a lot of other platforms where they find like-minded people that can offer answers to their questions to life. And it's actually quite neat because they get answers to their miserableness, to who is to blame for the miserableness, to the unfairness of the world, to the meaning of life, to which actions to take, to which identity to have. They can get questions, to get answers to the questions they have. They can get answers to life. Why is my life like this? And what can I do to change it? And who is at fault for my life being like this? They can get all these answers. And this creates a sense of everything making sense and of having meaning. And it explains why they are like they are. The problem is it's very much them looking outward into the world and finding blame and fault outside, and not looking inward and seeing, well, maybe it's because something. Not to say that they're at fault for their life being as it is, just to say that maybe sometimes you need to look at both ways. You need to look at both sides, both the outside world and yourself. So what these digital communities can offer these young men is a much needed sense of belonging, where they can find a place to call home, where they can find a place to be a part of something bigger. It's a place to find guidance when they're at a loss as to where to go in life and what to do about the obstacles they meet. They can find guidance here that can help them along the way and help them to figure out where should I go and which path is the best to take for me. It's a place to have safety. Many of these men feel very lonely and feel outcast from society. And this creates a safety net for them. It's a place where they can go with all their problems, all their issues, and somebody is there to listen and will take care of them and will actually listen to their problems and will actually also understand their problems. Because it's a place where other people know what they're talking about when they say they're miserable. Other people have experienced the same things. So it's a place where they actually feel understood, because this is one of the main problems for many of these men. The ones we've talked to, and as we can also tell from being on these different websites which they use, that they don't feel understood by the outside world. They feel that no one understands why they are as they are and why they're miserable. So it's also a place for them to find equals and peers. Many of these young men feel very lonely in their physical environments they are a part of in their daily lives. But when they go online, they find people who are like them, people who want to talk to them, people who want to engage in conversation with them, people who want to do things together with them, which they don't have in their physical environments. The problem is some of these platforms and forums also come with a dark side of discouragement, of this very dark view of how life is. There's nothing you can do about it. You might as well just give up now. There's also a lot of hopelessness in many of these places, where there's this sense of, well, it doesn't really matter. There's nothing you can do. You might as well just give up. Just don't even try, because it's hopeless anyway. We can't do anything about it and we're just stuck here. They can also have this sense of this dark side of destructive or even self-destructive behavior, where this created this tendency of having to one-up each other into who has it worst. Because for some of these men, they feel they might not have an identity in their physical environments, where they feel like they are a nobody. And when they go here, they actually get the identity of being, oh, okay, so I'm this person who is very miserable, who's very lonely. And when you've found this identity, you're as a human being, very keen to just do anything to hold on to it. If you feel like, well, if I don't have this, then I have nothing. So this can actually lead some of these young men to engage in some self-destructive behavior, in that they are willing to go a long way to keep their identity as these miserable, sad, lonely young men. Furthermore, some of these platforms encourage to act upon one's beliefs and one's ideas of what is the world supposed to look like, and what is it looking like right now, and what can I do to change that. So there are some places where they can encourage each other to act upon the miserableness they're feeling, the loneliness they're feeling. And this can, to the furthest extent, mean resistance and rebellion, meaning that they want to overthrow the government, they want to figure out how can we change the world because this isn't fair to me and to us. There is a line between these two, and most, fortunately, do not cross this border between having this very positive gathering, this very positive community to be a part of, that sometimes for some have a dark side. And fortunately, most do not cross this border. Most just use these as self-help communities, as groups where they find peers, where they find like-minded people, and where they can see and where they can get the help and the support they actually need. But some do cross this border, and those are the ones we have to be extra attentive to and extra careful of. Within these platforms and communities, there's often created this echo chamber effect where there's only posted content that relates to the narratives that are existing within this community, and that supports the views and beliefs of the community. So for many of these men who engage in these communities, it also means that when they're met with facts from the outside world, they have ways of thinking around it, of incorporating it into their own beliefs and changing the story as to fit their own narrative of how the world works. This is called motivated reasoning, because when you have one thought and you're met with another thought or fact that doesn't fit, it creates a state of cognitive dissonance, which is very uncomfortable. So some people would just change their beliefs in order to fit the new facts they've been met with. But if you are very set upon the unfairness of the world and this whole narrative of it being somebody else's fault, then you would rather just think around the new information and think of a way to make it fit to your own existing narrative. So, for instance, when there was the presidential election in the US, then a lot of the people part of these communities of of alt-right and all these communities would, rather than just listen to the numbers being, oh, okay, it looks like Trump is going to lose, they would say, oh, no, this can't be the case. It must be because they're counting wrong, or this is a fake election, all these things, instead of accepting, well, this is actually the truth. They're figuring out ways to think around it and make it fit the narrative that they want to further and the truth they believe. So it creates a different sense of what is this truth? They have their own truth, just like everybody has their own truth. But in order for society to work and for democracy to work, we have to agree on certain extents of this truth and agree on, well, this is actually how the world is put together. And that's the only way we can make democracy work. So those are the main lines of this. And now Christian will tell you a bit about the more social and cultural structures of these societies. There you go.
Thank you. And I apologize for the wobbly camera, but we just need to change the setting, as should be done sort of fine into here. Hi, my name is Christian. Thank you so much for joining us today. Brief introduction. I have a degree in philosophy and psychology, and I used to work in video games. I used to work as a community analyst and as a video game specialist. So my professional upbringing has been in understanding these digital communities, and I worked in that for quite a few years until I had to ask myself the question, why are gamers so angry? And that kind of led me down the rabbit hole of us against them narratives, usually men and boys against girls and women, which kind of led me onto the path of democratic analysis, egalitarian understanding of the internet. And what we do today is working with the angry internet. So our task, like Stine just presented it, is mainly to understand why the anger, why the angry protagonists or antagonists online. So the basics of what we found out in our qualitative investigations over the past couple of years have been that for all of the young men that we interviewed, that we found on what we deemed angry web pages and communities or angry forums, was that most of them would be happy to engage in an interview setting with me because I'm a man. They wouldn't talk to Stine because she's a woman, therefore she is evil or part of the opposition. They all started the interviews by saying, yes, I would love to explain to you why I am so angry. And then they started explaining why they were so sad. Like every interview we had started with something along the lines of, I never had any friends. No one ever wanted to hang out with me. I've never felt loved. And these young men thought that they were explaining why they were angry, and they were just putting into words why they were extremely sad. So what they all explained to us that they were missing was either sexual or romantic attention, or camaraderie or social engagements, or a respect for performance. And to a disproportionate degree, we found that, and I use the word disproportionate because at Center for Digital Youth Care, when we do talks, usually we do them physically in schools or in high schools, in places of education. Usually we can engage with the kids directly. And there, when we ask all the young men, so how are you feeling? All of them will say exactly the same thing. We're fine. We're good. It's all good. We're fine. Stine just explained the reasons as to why. But when we engaged them one-on-one in an anonymous online space, way more of them were inclined to say, actually, I'm not that fine. I would love to explain to you why. So these were the things that they were missing. But most of the men we talked to had also found someone to blame, because they weren't missing romantic or sexual interest or friends or respect because they weren't good enough. They were missing all these things because someone was keeping it from them, and therefore they didn't understand themselves as sad. They understood themselves as angry, as the opposition, as those fighting back, usually against women or people of color or people of different religious creeds. It was always a very distinct, this group of people are to blame. If not for this specific group of people, I would be way happier. If not for women, then I would be getting this. If not for immigrants, then I would be having this, so on and so forth. So what we found out was that young men gather in digital environments to discuss feelings they can't in physical spaces, usually the school or after-school curricular activities. They all have a very distinct idea of how life is supposed to be. They know exactly which aspects of the quote-unquote good life they do not have. And the ones that took interest to us in our findings were the ones that were ready to use anti-democratic strategies to gain those things: violence, manipulation, or revolution. The common narrative between all the young men that we talked to was that they needed to belong to this violent or this oppositional or antagonistic group, because if not, someone would hurt them or trump them or just roll over them. Usually we saw that there was this common narrative of the others, the women, the immigrants, the academics, the journalists, the left-wing media, the evil guys were after them. They all had a very strong idea that society as a whole was leveraged against them, that society would not help them. Society would help someone else. Society was feminist or unjust or pro-immigrant, and all these things that were benefiting people who were not them. They all had an idea of an elite that were both dangerous and malicious, like the millionaires, the journalists that helped the millionaires keep in place, and so on. And they all had this idea, this mental building block of you can't succeed alone. And all of these fears, all of these regrets would obviously be good to talk about, like with friends or with family or with a professional even. But our target group was young men, 15 to 35. We don't talk about things. Like, we don't. If you ask any one of us how we're doing fine. Like, we could be mid-divorce, drinking heavily, overweight, 1 year into a pandemic, and we'd be, no, it's all good. I'm fine. So instead of talking about it with someone else, they acted on it. They joined forces. They found the counterculture. They found the other men who had been done wrong by the elite or the immigrants or the women or the whatever. And they found someone who was readily available to protect them. They found someone who, without being questioned, would say, all right, young white man, we are so much on your side. We will protect you. We will help you against evil XYZ. And this sort of built into a common idea that most people are happy if they achieve their goals, if they have satisfaction at work, in their romantic life, private life, social life, and so on, they're happy. Sometimes they don't meet their goals, and then they're sad. There are these inevitable fluctuations, and we're either happy or sad. Usually, most of us have systems put in place to help us meet those goals. Family, school, education, friends, social networks. Our systems help us meet our goals. Sometimes the systems don't work. They're unresponsive, meaning that we don't meet our goals. Then we become unhappy. If we don't believe our systems could ever get into working again, we're filled with despair. We're filled with frustration. At some point, this loss of agency, this acknowledgement of not being able to meet my goals because my systems suck, so I'm stuck in this emotional state of unhappiness, despair, becomes too much. And as men, we're tasked not to just revel in our despair. We're brought up with the idea to fight back, to take what's rightfully ours, to power through and just meet our goals. So we have a choice of agency. The only agency we can have, because we can't do this alone, is to focus on something else than ourselves. We can join a counterculture. Joining a counterculture moves the focal point from me, who's unhappy, and I don't want to focus on me. I don't want to deal with the fact that I'm unhappy, to someone else, to those that are making me unhappy. Now I'm not a victim. Now I understand myself as a fighter. I get a sense of belonging. I have a place to direct my anger. I have a purpose. And most importantly, I have a purpose with other people. These countercultures will always have an object, an opposition. They will always be directed at big money or women or society as a whole. Like, they will always be focused on something. We need to counter someone. Could be women. It's very often women, because the most obvious thing for most of these men that made them unhappy was the fact that all the happy men had women. And then they had a causal understanding that because these men have women, therefore they are happy. They never turned it around and said, well, maybe if I get happy first, I get women. It was always the other way around. I need a woman object to make me, the subject, happy. So if we point the counterculture at women as an object, this counterculture will create a framework to understand past emotions. Once you engage in the counterculture, you'll be promoted with a framework for why you've been unhappy since you can remember. All of the young men that we talked to said, I never had any friends. I never had any romantic interest. I was never the sexual object of any woman. Therefore, I am unhappy. And all of their life choices was understood in the perspective of not having a woman or not having a woman's gaze fall upon them. And that means that I just need to move some of the camera here. And that means that we could frame that as this suicide note. This note was written by someone who shortly thereafter killed himself. Humanity, all of my suffering on this world has been at the hands of humanity, particularly women. It has made me realize just how brutal and twisted humanity is as a species. All I ever wanted was to fit in and live a happy life amongst humanity, but I was cast out and rejected, forced to endure an existence of loneliness and insignificance, all because of the females of the human species were incapable of seeing the value in me. So now I ask you, just take 5 seconds, think to yourself, is this suicide note wrote by someone who's angry or by someone who's sad? So this backwards understanding or backwards mental compatibility is also what drove Elliot Rodger before he killed 7 people in a school shooting and a school stabbing. Then he killed himself. So did you interpret his suicide note as angry or as sad? This is Alec Minassian, who killed several people in Canada, who heralded this guy as the supreme gentleman, as the one who put into words how all of us were feeling. The incel rebellion. Here's Alex Harper Mercer, who said, "Here I am, 26, with no friends, no job, no girlfriend." Obviously a sad statement. Then he went out and killed people. So what we saw was a lot of young men putting into words sadness, but we also saw them belonging to the same communities that had produced mass murderers and mass killers. So we had to understand and had to find the component that made some of them transgress the line that Stine talked about just minutes ago. Because often when these attacks, mass murders happen, they're framed as an isolated incident. He was just sad. He was just lonely. He was just crazy. Obviously, it's part of a bigger community movement because we see all of these young men promoting the same cultural milestones. We saw all of these communities, depending on ranging from talking about women or immigrants or society or cultural Marxism, whatever, all these countercultures had the same group of cultural fixed points. Could be Joker from the new movie, could be Rorschach from comics, it could be V from V for Vendetta. All of these anti-heroes, be it the Watchmen or the Joker or whatever, have the same framing. They are all heralded as wearing a mask. They become more than a man. They become an idea. They are lifted up to now be more than just a mere mortal. They are all fighting against unjust governments. They are all just fighting back. They are all just an image of the poor man that has been downtrodden by society and women. So now he's not only justified, but almost obligated in fighting back and killing those that have wronged him. All these images, Joker, Rorschach, V, all of them were plastered over all of the communities that we looked at. Because everybody needs superheroes. I had comic book heroes and rock stars on my walls when I was a teenager. These are the rock stars of some of these communities. So we also see this promotion or this fandom ranging into social media, ranging into actual people, not comic book heroes, who speak up for them. It can be bloggers, it can be political activists talking about, like, here's someone who said on his stream with several thousand viewers that if you are suicidal, why do you want to go out with just a whimper? Like, why do you just want to kill yourselves if you could kill 100 of those guys of the opposition before you kill yourselves? And like promoting this idea, not saying you should do this, just asking, why don't you? And talking about suicide fuel, talking about wanting to kill yourself because you're sad. And this is put into a framework where this is blamed at the opposition. Like when girls say they can't find a guy, yet they ignore me. It's like saying you're hungry if there's a hot dog on the ground outside. This idea of being super mean, deprecating to yourself, but also blaming the women of having put you in this place was told again and again and again in all the communities we observed. We see it in modern day speakers, some of them who are appropriated into being well-spoken, mannerismed weapons to use against feminists. Jordan Peterson is probably an anti-feminist, or at least he's a non-feminist. But he's always in these groups put into a framework of being the savior against feminism. And he is like the violent, he crushes feminism. He's used, like he's appropriated into these communities. And other speakers are exactly the same. The louder they are, the more aggressive they are, the easier it is to promote them in these communities. Because if you just keep on promoting, like, let's call Jordan Peterson mild anti-feminism, at some point, yeah, sure, we heard the Jordan Peterson argument. All men are lobsters and all that. Here are 12 good rules to being a man. Then that becomes kind of just meh. You don't notice it anymore. Then you need to turn it up. Then you need to quote Milo Yiannopoulos, who is ranging feminism against cancer. Then you need to like promote Andrew Anglin from the Daily Stormer, who say that women crave men who call them stupid and claim they shouldn't have any rights. Women crave being tied up, beaten, and raped, and so on and so forth. Because unless you make noise, you won't get noticed. And these young men joined these communities to get noticed. So we saw, if we followed the same user over months or even years on these communities, we saw them turning up the, let's call it, rhetorical volume. Like Stine just said, it also has to do with being in an echo chamber. Like, you get affirmation that these ideas are correct, even right. Well, then let's just find a more obvious, louder way to promote these ideas. So all of this often circled back to the idea that women were the object supposed to make the man, the subject, happy. There's a lot of talk about enforced monogamy, that this global cultural sexual frustration came about because women enforced, or at least women took the rights to their own bodies. So because women had the audacity to choose who they wanted to have sex with, all of the women chose the same kind of man. Tall, muscular, successful, good-looking, kind. Meaning that those men who weren't those things didn't get any. And because the women chose someone else, the men couldn't get the happiness that the woman could provide them. Therefore, an oft-cited solution to this is enforced monogamy. We need to have a powerful man state that will designate one woman to each one man. Then that way, if you are a good citizen man, then you will be rewarded with one good object woman. So this idea of enforced monogamy, we also find that in Jordan Peterson. We find that in a lot of, I don't want to call them thinkers, I want to call them YouTubers. But we do see this idea of enforced monogamy, that women's sexual freedom is the problem that feminism has bestowed upon us. Therefore, we need to fight feminism so we can have enforced monogamy. This is obviously a political spin on the fact that we want to have state-sanctioned rape. But nevertheless, it sounds like a really good idea if none of the women chose you. It's easier to point the finger at them instead of saying, well, what can I do to work with this that makes some of the women choose me? This is a psychologically easier approach. So it's understandable. It's not excusable, but it is to a certain degree understandable. What we saw, like the common narrative for these men, when we talked to them, when we interviewed them, they all talked about being ostracized, being cast out. They all talked about, I never fit in school. I was never elected for the football or soccer team. No one set up play dates. No one ever reached out to ask if I wanted to go out on Friday. So they, in the beginning of their narrative, they felt outside. They felt removed from youth society, from their physical society. Instead of keeping on trying to fit in, because that hurts. It hurts every time you ask someone, like, so you want to hang out? And they say, no, you're weird. So instead of keeping on trying to push inside physical local communities, they antagonized them. They said, well, not being part of this community over here, that is my choice. I chose not to fit in with those guys. And then they found the other kids, other young guys, who felt the same way. And then they made a group. They made a group based on the fact that we don't fit in with them, so fuck them. And that group could either be physical or, for the most count, was online. They built communities, they built web pages, they built gaming groups where they hung out and talked about not being part of this group. At that point, the weakness, the sadness, was then made into a weapon to promote a belonging in a new group. That creates these oppositional communities. We don't hang out because we all play Call of Duty or Minecraft. We hang out with each other because we don't hang out with those guys, because we don't want to. We are better than them, so we shouldn't hang out with them. that creates a form of reactionary activism. Every time this group does something, we're against it. No matter what it is, we're against it. And that is why you can, like, I saw it this morning when I promoted this event on my Twitter. I saw someone saying, well, feminism is a blight on humanity. We should not do feminism. Because you do feminism, that is why men are sad. And I, in my tweet, didn't acknowledge that I'm a feminist or anything like that. I didn't say this was a feminist event. I was saying we're going to be talking about vulnerable, angry young men. Someone framed that as me being part of the opposition, so they were against the idea. That is reactionary activism. I'm against what you do just because it's you who's doing it. What we fear, what we saw that historically and also in our observational studies scared us a bit, was when this reactionary activism became proactive. When someone would go out of their way to fight women before women had a chance to speak up. Like when they were just actively anti-feminist. When they wanted to make sure that like enforced monogamy is a very obvious proactive activism. We take away women's freedom to choose sexual or romantic partners. We take away women's rights in the workplace. We take away, like, look at the backlash against Me Too. That muddies the water between reactionary activism and proactive activism. But once these groups turned into proactive activist groups, things got really scary. Because then these groups wouldn't meet online to talk about something that happened. They wouldn't bring in news articles and say, well, the feminists believe this, so I think we should believe the opposite. Once these groups turned proactive, the men or the people in the groups would meet online and say, I bet women are thinking this. I bet feminists are plotting this. I am sure that because someone told me that his friend's uncle's nephew's dad is part of the society or part of the political power elite, he told me that they will do this. And then they started building conspiracy theories. Because once they had a conspiracy theory that all women are super evil, they meet every Wednesday evening to talk about who they should allow to have sex with. Like, if this is the image you have of women, well, then yeah, you should be anti-women because these people are clearly evil. But that is the dangers of proactive activism. You need to build up a monster so you can join forces against it. We saw a lot of that happening. We saw a lot of conspiracy theories about women and women's bodies, how women's bodies worked, how we saw ideas of usually it was built up around sex. So it was often something like pregnancy is a choice. The woman can choose to have a baby if she's raped. And often she would choose to have the baby because if a man rapes a woman, he's a big, strong man. So she wants to have sex with him because that's how the fragile and frail women brain work. This idea of the women's body as a tool for the malicious intent that women have was oft cited as the reason why men should combat women's freedom. Like, women should literally or figuratively be kept on leashes and be controlled by a good, sane, level-headed, non-hysterical man. But these men also saw themselves as victims of women. And over the past 10, 15 years, we have promoted hashtag Me Too, hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag feminism, hashtag he for she, and so on. And all of these men, or most of these men, saw these movements, the Me Too, the Black Lives Matter movement, as attacks on them. Because these movements seek to reform the white supremacy or the white patriarchy movements in societies all over the globe. And these men looked at themselves and said, well, I'm white, I'm a man, I'm unhappy, my life sucks. And these people over here, the women and the Black people, the people of color, are talking about me having all the privilege in the world. My life fucking sucks, and now they want to take away from it. I need to combat Me Too, Black Lives Matter, feminism, and so on, because they saw these movements as against them personally. And instead of framing themselves as victims, they framed themselves as this romantic idea of part of a resistance movement. That sounds really good. I'm 33. I grew up on video games. I have like this nightly fantasy of joining a resistance movement. That sounds really kick-ass. And these resistance movements were then framed as needing real good men. So these resistance movements that were anti-women also came with like 10 steps, or in Jordan Peterson's sake, 12 steps to becoming a good man, like the manly man, the man's man. You can see it online today. There will be promotional videos for alpha males, or the new thing, sigma males, so you don't become a beta male or an omega male. Like, you want to be a leader of the pack, not just a follower or a runt. Like, this framework of how to do man, that's really compelling. I would have at several different stages in my life love to have read those books or those guidelines. How do I do man? Because it's really hard to figure out on your own, especially if you're afraid to comment on your insecurities or your vulnerabilities. But all of these guidelines as to how to become a man were built on the same ideas of, you need to go out in nature. You need to have one woman and protect her. You need to have enough money to build a good life in a just society. You need to eat meat, none of this tofu or seitan stuff. You need the good, manly, muscular proteins. And like, you need to drink your coffee black. No milk, that's for women and babies, just coffee. Like this, it's a very basic idea of a man, but that's what's so compelling about it. Like, if I just do this checklist of 5-6 things, then I'm a good man. Yeah, and then there would always be, well, you also need to read Nietzsche. You need to listen to these albums. Then there was this cultural maxim of how to do manly man right. And it's basically just a checklist. And that is, I can't repeat it enough, that is extremely compelling. Even to me as a mid-30s man, like, I'm happy. But having a checklist of how I could be happier, it sounds like a really good idea. Like, I'd love to believe in it because it sounds easy. But that leads us down this rabbit hole to this cross path where we'd find quotes like this one: feminist culture will eventually end up being squashed because the men have either become too demoralized and weakened to protect their women, or because they've become so fed up with the incessant ridicule that they just don't care anymore. This is Anders Behring Breivik in his testament or manuscript manifest before he killed 80 people and injured more than 300 people in Norway 10 years ago. But this is the narrative of women have weakened men so much that once the dangerous immigrants roll over our borders, the men will either not want to protect the women because they're annoying, or they've become so riddled with soy products and milk in their coffees that they can't. So therefore, men needs to fight feminists and immigrants. If we combine all of these traits, then we build what is popularly called the manosphere. The manosphere is built on two distinct ideas: that there's a biological determinism to how you are as a person, like men are good in these things, leading, building, fighting, thinking. Women are good in these things, looking good, taking care of the offspring, and just like, women stuff. But feminism is then trying to say that women can do all the things that a man can. The manosphere obviously believe that to be a lie, because if the women could do all the things that a man could, society would become weak and vulnerable to outside interference, usually immigrants. So biodeterminism and anti-feminism is the structural points of the manosphere. But then the manosphere can have different chapters, different groups inside of it. There can be the physically, protectively focused groups. There is the sexually focused groups. There is the politically inclined groups. And for an example, men's right activism is the belief that we need to have men's rights groups to promote the rights of men in the face of evil, oppressive feminism. It can be the alt-right, the kind of the same, but then with a tidbit of ultra conservatism, like we're super scared of immigrants and feminism wants immigrants, so we're opposed to both. It can be the men going their own way, who believe that women have infested and toxified society, so we need to move into the woods, literally, and build our own new societies. There's the pickup artists who believe that women are frail airheads that, well, if you just tell them the right magic words, they will want to have sex with you. So again, women as object to the male subjective happiness. Incels who will violently try to combat the idea that women have a right to their own bodies, and so on and so forth. Like we can populate this this manospheric triangle with several other groups. But the key factor for all these groups is that they're social. There's a community built around the group. They are built on conspiracies. Like I told you before, most of these groups are very proactive activism minded. They don't have a leader per se, but they will have banner lords or people that they will promote as he has the right idea, or we will follow him, or he is our flavor of the week. He's our spokesperson this week. They're oppositional. All of these groups are not pro-men, but anti-women. Most of them have an online basis because there's not a lot of men, like numerically yet, who believe in these ideas. So they need to use online forums to find each other and to promote and discuss these ideas. They all have a very distinct linguistic component, which is also what we use to track and measure and analyze them. We looked at like how many people use these words, how do they use them? Are men or women the subject or object of sentences promoted in these forms, and so on and so forth. We looked at vulnerable men, but we do know that some men from these communities will actively seek out, like this is the extreme proactive activism, to kill, maim, or hurt, scare, terrorize women. They can do it for, like, the great replacement is the idea that if we don't take care, for an example, the calculation they use is that Denmark will be overrun with more than 50% immigrants, Muslim immigrants, by the year 2065, because the feminists will let them. So we need to actively fight, shoot, combat both feminists and those immigrants they want to allow over our borders, or all women are evil idea, the incel theory that all women are using sex as a tool or currency to get what they want from the men, because women are too weak to build it themselves, so they need to trade men sex to do so. Like, these are two of the conspiracies that will lead some men, some parts of these groups, to fight women. But we also see, and this is far more prevalent, especially in the Nordic countries, at least from what we found, is that most often women are attacked by not violent measures, but digital violent measures. They're hacked, they're exposed to threats, fake photos, their personal information is leaked online, so people can seek them out in their private homes and so on. This is almost exclusively done to women and people of color or minorities, especially women deemed loud or hysterical. Politicians, policymakers, influencers, and so on are actively targeted. We know for a fact from the Institute for Human Rights 2019 at Lumisuleta that this means that more and more women disengage from the public debate. Therefore, mitigating these movements is not just a question of personal safety, it's also a question of democratic freedom. Right now, we have voices being silenced. That is a huge problem. That is a global level democratic problem we have right now. We also know that these men, when surveyed, are scoring extremely low on well-being, social clout, and low happiness. We know that most of these communities started as a oppositional culture, as a way to survive, not fitting in anywhere else, or as a place where they can entertain ideas that would not be accepted in the classroom or amongst their friends. This is also a question of well-being and freedom of speech. So when we look at the communities, we see these ideas both on the mainstream media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram. We see them a bit more on the geekier websites. Signal is often used because it's end-to-end encryption communication. Discord, Reddit, the Pirate Bay as well. Like, this doesn't mean that these geeky web pages are in any way dangerous. I spend, I think, 70 to 80% of my online time on Reddit because it also has amazing geeky communities for video game or role-playing geeks or musicians and so on, which I use it for. So it's a huge community that has different sub-chapters, just like 4chan and Telegram and Parler, that can be used for good or just freedom of speech movements, but have currently been appropriated or being maybe even promoted as countercultural alternatives to Facebook and Twitter. Because Facebook will block or moderate your content, you need to move to MeWe or Parler. Because Twitter will shut down your account, you'll have to move to Telegram and so on. So basically, these countercultural platforms offer the freedom of speech to those who are moderated or even blocked on Facebook and Twitter. But because they are only populated by those kicked out of Facebook and Twitter, they very often become the echo chamber that Stine talked about earlier. And then we have the communities that are built up around actively not trying to fit in. That be it 8kun or communities built on the dark web, they are just built in opposition to the mainstream. What we found is that even though we have some men who will dive down the rabbit hole, at some point they'll find a community, they'll find a hub where they can talk about these ideas, where they can promote them, where they can express their arguments or even hone their argumentative skills to why women, immigrants, communities, society, politicians are evil. And then at some point they'll start moving back. So there's this pendular effect of the men diving down the rabbit hole and then doing activism up towards the, let's call it, surface level social media. We saw often that some of these communities would have, here you'll find it at the second removed from the left screenshot, that they would have attack packs where men would engage in, I have a woman who is promoting this idea on my Facebook timeline. How do I combat her? And sometimes it would be then 100 men from this community would rush, like it's called a circling tactics, named after an old video game called Star Wars. Sorry, not Star Wars. But then 100 men, it's named after a StarCraft strategy. Then 100 men from the countercultural community would rush onto this woman's Facebook page and post derogatory things about her, and then they'd rush back. So like that would be one thing that the attack pack could do. Other things would be stories like this, where a young man was saying that when he walked around town, every time he passed a woman, he would mumble like, fuck you, piece of shit, I'm gonna rape you. And if confronted, he would just say like, no, I wasn't doing anything. But he would like terrorize people locally. And this is then promoted as a strategy that other men can employ to deal with their feelings. But these attack packs would also actually have crisis helplines, like anti-suicide prevention hotlines. And often some of these I hate women talks would turn into, does anyone else get that feeling? Maybe if you explain more. And then we have two men who, because they're anonymous online, started talking about emotions, started talking about why he's so upset, why he's sad. And then he gets better. And also, actually, just to tie the story up nicely, the young man who was walking around town mumbling fucking whore at women and so on, wrote a bit later in the day, after a lot of men had said, yeah, you should do that, women are evil. Then he came back onto the forum and said, my mom was in a car crash, she's okay, but it scared me on top of an already stressful day. That is a healthy reflection. Like, he ventilated, then he reflected this is a good progression. So some of these communities, even though they do talk about women in extremely hurtful, extremely derogatory terms, would also promote this kind of communication. And one of the primary authors, who is administrator or even owner, he made the website for incels in the whole world, talked about building a website or a community filled with people who are at their lowest. They suffer, they're alone, and while they can talk about their plight, their hurts on other spaces, most people on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram don't get their issue. They will be, the men will be suggested to keep trying, to man up, to be more confident. And this makes little of the suffering that the man is feeling. Therefore, the men were left emotionally homeless when another forum for incels, Sad Boys, was banned, closed down. And the forum that he created is then an attempt to make a emotional home for these men. That's a beautiful thought. It is not succeeding 100% because there is extremely violent rape promotion material on that website, but this is the idea behind it. So when we look at these challenges and problems as a whole, we need to find out what do we do about it. And we'll talk about that at a later point, not today, but in a week. But if we just branch out, we need to look at, usually we are articulating the most severe and also latest solution. To protect victims, we must prosecute, we must ban, we must close down communities. That is the last line of defense, just to pull the plug on the internet and shut down their forms of communications. What Stina and I is promoting is that maybe before we do that, in a timely manner, before the men reach the level where this is necessary, to mitigate that the men keep moving down this emotional rabbit hole, we the pro-social communities should find a way to integrate these at-risk men with extremely low social well-being back into what we deem the pro-social or good society. One way to do that, one way to prevent this rabbit hole or ostracization or antagonization from the men is to, from a very early stage, we're talking preschool, emotionally empower boys to promote healthy coping mechanisms before they understand that there is a biological difference between them and other people in society. This is not just a pull the plug on the internet problem. This is a problem with extremely unhappy, and in their own world, extremely powerless young men. So if we leave you with one thing today, is a notion to be aware that if we reduce these movements to just being angry or just being violent, then we're fixating on symptoms rather than the root cause of a global problem. Thank you so much for today. We'll be here for the panel debate in just a short while.
Thank you very much, Christian. Great presentation again. I've seen you before, and thank you very much, Stina, as well. I'm very happy for this. Lots of food for thought, that's for sure. So you'll be staying with us, as you said, for at least 1 more hour, and we'll have a panel discussion with our other speakers at about half an hour. Just before we go to our next speaker, which would be Ash Allen, I just would like to see how you're doing right now in the people are attending. We're actually right now 92 people here. So I just want to launch a poll. I hope it works. So how do you feel right now? Do you feel angry? Do you feel happy? Do you feel curious? Maybe tired? Maybe hungry? Maybe hyped? Maybe calm or excited? Or you feel chill, or you're maybe not sure? So please answer. Yeah, you've got instant feedback already, Christian and Stina. A brilliant presentation. We can read it in the chat. Thank you for the comments. And don't forget, you can post your questions in the Q&A, and our guests and us will try to answer them as fast as we can, or maybe alongside this webinar. Okay, so I got 65% who have voted. I want to have at least 70%. Please vote. We're getting somewhere now. I'm going to close the poll just in a couple of seconds, so state your vote. Okay, so 70% has voted, and this is what the answers are. We have, let's see, the biggest group right now is the curious one. So we have some curious people here. Yep, that's great. After that, we have an excited group here with 20%. Then we have people who are not sure about the emotions. Maybe it's mixed feelings, I guess. Yeah, and we actually have somebody who's angry, and I can understand that for sure. Okay, so these are the results, and now I think it's time for us to move on and to say welcome to our friend and colleague as well, Asha Allen from the European Women's Lobby. Please, Asha, welcome to this webinar.
Thank you, Lewis, and thank you very much for the invitation. I think our friends who are managing the system are going to share my presentation for me.
Okay, great.
So if we could have that loaded, that'd be amazing. Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me here. And thank you to the presenters who were just speaking. A great presentation. I think it very much opens up the question in regards to what has a patriarchal society taught these men that they're actually entitled to, which I think ties in very much to your last question and looking at the root causes of these issues. But today I'm coming to you from my organization, the European Women's Lobby, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about the consequences of the anti-feminist movement and what the women's civil society perspective has been. In my role at the European Women's Lobby, I am one of the policy and campaign officers who coordinates our work on eradicating violence against women and girls, specifically online violence against women and girls. So a nice tie-in from our previous presenters. But before I jump into the meat of the content, I just want to present who we are. So Jessica, if we could just go to the next slide, please, for me. Thank you so much. So for those of you who don't know us, the European Women's Lobby, we are the largest umbrella organization of women's civil society in Europe. We've actually worked with many of your organizations over the years, but we are over 2,000 member organizations, and we represent about 15 million women across the EU and accession countries, but we have not counted those women individually. So don't quote me on that 50 million number, but that's what we estimate. For the last 30 years, we've been advocating for the full equality between women and men in Europe. And we've done this through 4 key areas in, of course, ending all forms of violence against women and girls, for a transformed economy that benefits all of us and fosters socioeconomic independence for all. For access to safe and comprehensive sexual reproductive health and rights, and that includes comprehensive sexuality education for girls and boys, and to foster women's political leadership, as well as in the social field and in the private sector as well. So this is what we predominantly focus on. But today I wanted to talk to you about our experiences over the last few years, particularly in the context that Christian and Stina were talking about in this growing anti-feminist movement, anti-human rights, anti-migrant movement, and what this has meant for women's civil society. So if we could just pop onto the next slide, that would be great. So as previously presented, we're very aware of this kind of new heightened environment of anti-movements. And I call them broadly anti-movements because at any given time, they may be anti-feminist, they may be anti-human rights, they may be anti-migrant, they may be anti-ethnic minorities. But at the crux of it, it is a coordinated opposition to progressive movements. And the perspective of individual rights being removed as these movements gain wins. So we've been extremely aware of this in Europe, and our members have consistently raised the alarm for us on this growing oppositional discourse that we've seen and the consequences of those discourses. But at the foundation of those discourses is exactly what we've just been talking about. So this promotion of traditional roles for women and men, and what's being lost when we move away from these traditional roles, and how identity comes into this. We've seen, of course, and from my expertise, what is happening in the online space. I think it's quite easy for us to pull out what is happening from the negative perspective, but never to forget that at the crux of the online space is this idea of freedom of information, freedom of access, and freedom for movement building, which many progressive movements have utilized over the years. And so what we're seeing is the online space becoming the forefront, as it was the battleground for where this discourse is really taking a strong narrative that fosters gender stereotypes. A consequence of this for us as women in civil society is the increasing shrinking space of civil society, and that's in regards to the available resources or spaces for civil society to come together and to collaborate with one another. And this increasingly hostile, polarized online space, which is coming to fruition within a very transformed political and collective discourse that we're seeing, is creating a sense that civil society, particularly women's civil society, needs to be reactionary rather than proactive in promoting the transformative change that we've been demanding for so many years. So it has created a sense of tension. It has created a sense of urgency, and it's also created a sense of that there's a concept of a pie, and that we need to kind of all argue for the elements of this pie and how much we can push for it. And this is actually quite deliberate, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that in the discussions later. But I wanted to talk about some key moments that we've noticed over the last few years. So if we could pop to the next slide. So the consequences from a political aspect have been very, very clear for us. So many of you may be familiar with the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. That is actually celebrating its 10-year anniversary this year in May. And there was a lot of progression with this particular convention in the years leading up to 2017, 2016, with the majority of EU member states having signed and ratified, and the EU as a regional organization also agreeing to accede to the convention. But as these discourses began to increase and gain traction and become subject to a very coordinated effort to spread disinformation, anti-feminist sentiments, and to position the feminist and human rights perspective as an attack on individual liberties, as an attack on freedom of speech, and as an attack of people's personal beliefs, we began to see growing opposition towards that convention. And I'm sure our colleagues will touch on this later. But unfortunately, at the EU level, the process for acceding has all but stalled, all but stopped, and there has been no progress over the last 3 to 4 years on making sure that women in Europe receive the same levels of protection, and there are harmonized measures to ensure that no one experiences any form of violence or domestic violence. As I'm sure you may be aware, there have been increasingly regressive laws on sexual reproductive health and rights. So we stand with our sisters in Poland, opposing the very oppressive rules and regulations around free access to safe abortion. Similarly, our colleagues in Romania are experiencing opposition to comprehensive sexuality education. And across Europe, we're seeing a pushback on certain aspects in access to certain subjects, such as gender equality degrees, or even how we talk about this particular issue. It's quite comprehensive in what we're seeing across Europe. The European Institute of Gender Equality has highlighted that there's actually been no progress on women's rights, particularly since 2017. And it's quite clear the correlation of this onset of social media from 2010 onwards and what we're seeing in the slowing down of progress of women's and humans' rights. There is a very clear correlation for us. And this also spreads into the other aspects of work that we work on. So the move towards a care deal for Europe to ensure that everyone equally benefits from our society, and that care is at the heart of our economic and political frameworks has stalled. And similarly, the Women on Boards Directive, which you may be familiar with, a directive to push private enterprises to have more women in positions of leadership, has been stalled for many, many years, but the opposition to it has continuously been growing, particularly in this new environment. During the height of the COVID-19 lockdown, and we are all still in this particular lockdown, what we saw, in fact, was a push towards a more recognition of the contribution of women to society, and actually to shift to a much more positive outlook and embracing by society towards understanding and recognizing the issues and coming together more collectively. Women make up the majority of those who are on the front line of providing services. So over 70% of essential workers and healthcare providers in Europe were women. And essentially, women were keeping the world going. And what we saw was that in response to this, there were some good measures taken, but this opposition movement was also being embedded in this perspective of, we can't just focus on women, or we can't focus on those providing those services, and why do we need to protect migrants and these other groups in relation to COVID-19. So even in the height of a crisis, of a pandemic, you could see that this rhetoric was remaining strong, was remaining coordinated. And as we moved to the online space, as we're doing today, either for working or education, one of the aspects that we saw was an increasingly violent and unsafe physical unsafe space for women online. One example would be in the UK, that particularly women of colour, the amount of online abuse, death threats, rape threats they received increased by over 84% during the period between March and December. And we are seeing similar statistics regards to women across Europe. And the online space is becoming increasingly more relied upon for our everyday living, and increasingly more unsafe for women and girls to be able to engage in. So in regards to those aspects, this is what we saw, and what we did as the European Women's Lobby. We strongly advocated for women's contributions during the height of the pandemic to be recognised, despite this should have been quite obvious. And we started to focus a lot of our attention on how we can make the online space a much safer space, and have that engagement with different groups in regards to collaboration and actually celebrating the wins that we have. So if we move to the next slide, what I wanted to highlight was some of the fantastic work that was done in this new environment that we saw. For the European Women's Lobby, it was very clear that we did not want to be reactionary. We have seen as civil society, and I'm sure many of you share this perspective, that we get a lot more done and achieve a lot more when we're coming from a place of positivity, of growth, and of progress. And what we were able to see, that being reactionary seemed to actually exacerbate the discourse negatively. So we really wanted to stay away from that, and we fostered strong collaborative action. So what you're seeing here, some of you may be familiar with some of those spaces. We coordinate the European Coalition to End Violence Against Women and Girls, so a network of human rights civil society organisations, of which Men Engage is also a member. And we come together to advocate for the eradication of violence. And we came together to really develop an effective communications campaign. How do we talk about what we're talking about in progress without people feeling isolated, to really put forward a positive framing on what we're talking about, and how people can engage and recognize that we are talking about progress and to the betterment of all society. Our members similarly led actions, and they are leading the charge in so many of the places that I've talked about, in Hungary, in Poland, in France, in the Netherlands, and across Europe as well. But it was not enough for us to really denounce and decry what was going on, or to analyze the communication. What we wanted to do was make sure that we stayed focused on action, because we saw from our testing with our members that actually staying bogged down in just the communication and just what was happening in the online space was stalling the progress that we needed in the political level and the societal level as well. So we adopted new communication strategies, emphasizing stories, and looking into how could we build a movement across Europe, actually utilizing the online space and not forgetting the positives that it has for us. And we similarly looked into how can we specifically protect women's rights defenders, particularly those who were organizing mobilization online, because as Christiane and Stina mentioned, those particular women were not only unsafe in the online space, but being doxxed means they became unsafe in the physical space as well. So how could we marry the two and make sure that there was a clear prioritization of both? So if we could just pop to the next slide. So I wanted to bring us to where we came to as women's civil society, and we just wanted to reiterate the need to come together and articulate and build a vision of what we could be. I think there was a sense at first to be slightly reactionary and not try and comprehend where this seemed to be coming from and understand our enemy, as it were. But we realized actually that was part of the tactic to get bogged down in that conversation and completely stall progress. So what we wanted to reiterate was our power in ourselves and our power in each other and our power to work together to shape the future. We know that solidarity and cooperation across borders is needed to build the peaceful, sustainable, more equal, inclusive and caring communities that we all wanted to be part of. So that's what we put at the heart of our advocacy, of our strategy planning and of our communications. For EWR personally, we completely revamped our communication strategy around this, but also in regards to how we worked with other organizations as well. What we also put at the heart of this was stories of resistance and of hope, and reminding ourselves to celebrate those wins and give recognition to the actions of young activists who are making change. Some of the movements that we talked about in the last presentation, Me Too, Balance Ton Port, Black Lives Matter, the climate justice movement, for example, these were started by young activists who mobilized online. We are now in a changed political and social situation where there is the opportunity for radical transformative change, because we are having those conversations and because there's more recognition of what a more equal world looks like, with care and equality at the center of it. There have been political wins, of course, at the EU level. We have a more gender equal commission than ever before. We have more women leaders of countries than ever before, and we're celebrating many of those women leaders as well. We are celebrating the fact that there are more people engaged in the discussion of feminism and understanding feminism from an intersectional and inclusive perspective, and more people coming forward as feminists and those who support equality. We have more activists coming together and fostering intersectional dialogue about our online spaces, recognizing how unsafe they are and working together to figure out how they can be much safer. So our key message from our members and to the organizations that we work with was that this changing political and social environment that we live in at the moment was an opportunity and remains an opportunity for radical transformative change. And whenever you are pushing for radical transformative change, there is going to be opposition, and there's going to be those who decry what you're trying to do. But we had to remain steadfast, and we have to remain steadfast, and understanding the impacts of a patriarchal society on all of us is at the foundation of this. And I really want to pick up on my last point there on the previous presentation in what came through very, very strongly, which is a patriarchal society which is embedded in misogyny or racism and anti-feminism has a negative impact on us all, including those who are the angry men online. What does it lead us to believe that we're entitled to? What does it lead those who understand that they are not beneficiaries of that patriarchal system? What do they have to put up with? So I wanted to leave on a very positive message. I want to pass on over to our colleague David and make sure he had all the time that he needed to speak. But just to reiterate that last message, that we are in this opportunity for transformative change, and that we must grasp it with both hands. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Asha. Great. I was really glad to hear the positive stuff that you also mentioned, for sure. Thank you very much that you ended in the positive way. And I think we're gonna have to talk a bit more about it. I see you also got some questions already, but we'll keep them for the panel, okay? So yes, now I just want to present our last speaker, and it's our colleague and friend from Bulgaria, David Kuranov from Association Roditeli, which means parents in Bulgarian. Yes, David, please, welcome.
Thank you, Luis. Everybody already said that, but I will be happy to say it out loud. Fascinating analysis from Christian and Stine, and a great presentation from Asha. Thank you for keeping us so up to date and so with your in-depth insights. Right, so I suppose I must share my screen. Let me see. Right. So is it okay when it's full screen now?
It's perfect, David. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'll be speaking about a specific case of the backlash. So what's happening in Bulgaria in the recent years, and now you will see there are many organized actions. So let us start. We don't have much time. I'll try to keep it short, and of course, after that, anyone who wants can get the presentation if you're interested. About something about the European context, maybe you probably already know that Agenda Europe, the so-called Agenda Europe, is a Vatican-inspired professional advocacy network whose members meet in secret, and and which is directly responsible for implementing a detailed strategy to roll back human rights. This is a quotation from Mr. Neil Datta's Restoring the Natural Order analysis, which I suppose many of you already know, but if you don't, it's a great overview of what Agenda Europe is doing, and I recommend it. A couple of things about Agenda Europe, created in 2013 in London. American and European communication experts and strategists who are starting to formulate then in 2013 achievable goals for restoring the natural order. They plan campaigns for abolishment of human rights, sexual reproductive health in Europe, and to create a Christian think tank. The group includes Catholics from the Vatican, Protestants from radical denominations, Orthodox Christians mainly from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The main organization behind this is called Alliance Defense Freedom, ADF. You can find the website on the internet. These are some of the main organizations part of Agenda Europe. There are organizations from the USA, the International Organization for the Family, the World Congress of Families, as we mentioned already, Alliance Defense Freedom, Family First Foundation. From Russia, main supporters are the Russian Orthodox Church, the Russian Center, and there are organizations in Europe, like the European Center for Law and Justice, European Center for Christian Political Movement in Belgium, Political Network for Values in Spain, International Center for Law, Family and Life, and many anonymous platforms with large influence. What is most important is that those organizations, as well as in Europe, also in Bulgaria, are hybrid. They stand behind what they call family values, childcare, etc. But behind this, their actions are actually aimed at restricting the children's rights, women's rights, and supporting the patriarchy. Here on this slide, you can see the four main strategies of Gender Europe. We should not, they say we should not be afraid of being unrealistic or extremists. The first strategy is use our opponents' weapons against them. Strategy 2 is treat our questions as rights. So they also speak about rights. The latest development in Bulgaria is that there are proposed changes in the Child's Protection Act. As rights, they now are trying to induce some notions like biological parents, like the right of the parents to do what they want with their child. But more of this a bit later. Strategy 3, paint opponents as bad and institutions as unfavorable. And strategy 4, we need to become a respected player at international level, at European level and at the United Nations. All these strategies have been strictly followed since 2013. A couple of messages related to the Bulgarian context. Maybe you've heard them also in your countries, like save the children from European values. More than 1,500 stillborn and aborted babies in the United States are used for fuel. I will not read them all, as I mentioned, because we don't have much time. But as I mentioned, you can have the presentation if you're interested. But you can see the EU promotes pedophilia. I can do whatever I like with my child. Children should be disciplined with a thinner stick, not a thick one, etc., etc. Their approach is through fear, uncertainty, insecurity, anger, fake news, nonsense, anxiety, and especially in Bulgaria, many people believe those messages. The tools used: fake news, distortion of the truth, very well prepared public messages. So as far as we know, those organizations are well trained in what they do and are very effective. Civic mobilization, nets of information cells and supporters in European countries and many other. Advocacy and lobbying at national, European and international level. Mainly in social media, but not only. Many protests were organized here in Bulgaria in the last couple of years. Creating enemies and eliminating them, creating media monsters like gender, like Soros, like the NGOs, etc. And connecting it with far-right politics. Couple of words for the key actors in Bulgaria. First of all, the so-called Association Family and Values, which is funded by the World Congress of Families. And it's a very good example of what I mentioned as a hybrid organization. I can give you an example. Currently, one of their main yearly events is going on. It's called the Week of Marriage, and I'm receiving now emails for each day of this Week of Marriage for what can I do with my partner, with my children, etc., etc. And some of the messages are, very positive, like support your partner, talk with him or her, etc., etc. There is also a representation of such organizations in the parliament, mainly by the VMRO, Bulgarian National Movement, which is a political party. It is now represented in the parliament, but probably we have parliament elections in the beginning of April, and probably this party will fall out of the parliament. But now they are suggesting changes in the Child Protection Act. Then the national group Parents United for the Children, which is a Facebook group, I would say rather a cluster of Facebook groups. Most of them are local for different cities, and a lot of young parents are members of these groups. And finally, National Association March for the Family. So what they succeeded in Bulgaria in the last 10 years, you could say 10 or 12, first blocking of amendments to the family code regarding factual cohabitation in 2008, blocking surrogacy in 2011, blocking Draft Child Protection Act in 2012, blocking the Istanbul Convention in 2018. I think this was their the biggest success they had. Finally, the Istanbul Convention was declared unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court here. In 2019, blocking the strategy for the child. They are currently attacking the topic of banning abortions. And current bill proposed by this party I mentioned, the VMRO, tries to induce notions like biological family in the Child Protection Act and attacks the social services providers. A couple of words, why is this happening here? So political parties don't have the will for real reforms in the field of social policies, healthcare, and education. Government agencies are ineffective in working with citizens and NGOs. NGOs are weak, underfunded, mostly social service providers, and they're not actively working with citizens, not publicly communicated and discredited. And as an opposite, organizations like Association, Family and Values are very well prepared in how to do communication campaigns. So we also lack campaigns, and we can say that the society has not yet developed proper understanding and sensitivity towards human rights. What we can suggest, what we can do about it. First, recognition of the problem, that is very serious, that inflicts harm on children, women, and in general on democracy in our societies. We should strive for recognition by the United Nations, the EU, and other international organizations. Second, consolidation at the civic, political, and philanthropic level for counteraction. Third, investment resources in counter-propaganda, media literacy, and advocacy for children's rights at European and national level. And building mutual aid networks. I think this is one thing we are doing also right now. A quick example for what happened to the strategy for the child in 2019. It was drafted in January 2019, and immediately dozens of statements against the document were published. Most of them individual, but also statements from several organizations and the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. The main issue was the proposal of corporal punishment ban. Later, the narrative changed to they're taking away the children from us, and many people, and I really say a lot of young parents, believed. The campaign was constructed with sharing stories, clips, cases, pictures, leaflets in the social media, many examples of the weak child protection system, several press conferences, petitions with more than 20,000 signatures, Facebook group with currently 168,000 members, and protests in 21 cities in Bulgaria. This is quite a campaign, and it was really it was a lot in the media, you can say. Some of the slogans: the new strategy for the child will allow the state to make decisions for the families. It will give greater rights to the children at the expense of the rights of the parents. Our children are not for sale. Why foreign funded NGOs are writing the strategy for our children? We are against the juvenile justitia. No to the gender ideology. Bulgarians rise and save our children. Finally, the strategy was stopped by the Prime Minister after the protests, even though the campaign continued, like with slogans like "They want your children," and children will be transferred to Norway. So I don't know why, but it was a really great threat for the parents here. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope I'm on time.
Thank you very much, David. Yes, I mean, you gave us a real good example on how it can look like in a specific country and in specific places, from your perspective. Thank you very much for that. So now I want to invite everybody, if you just stop sharing the screen, David, then we can...
I'm trying, yeah.
Yes, great. Yeah, it's going well. So can I please invite Christian and Stine and Asha to put on your cameras? You too, David, you can stay here with us. Nice to see you again. So yeah, so I was thinking to starting by actually to try to have a round where, because you got actually some questions already in the Q&A. So I was thinking let's bring those questions first. But maybe before that, just a quick round of some kind of what would be your first impressions of the different presentations that you had? Just a short one, and if there's something specific that you can highlight from what you've heard from your colleagues. So yeah, so let's start with Christian and Stine.
I think one thing that I take away is, especially with the perspective from Bulgaria as well, is that most of these arguments aren't malicious in their upbringing. All of the arguments, either pro-feminism or anti-feminism or pro this movement or this and that, all of them have the same curriculum of we need to protect or we need to promote. Like all of them are positive in their outlook. And I think as a communicative strategy in both Europe and the world over the next years, like the trench war is very easy to enforce. Like we have feminists on one side, anti-feminists on the other side. But I think one thing that would be beneficial to us would be to engage in the conversation of, well, we can all agree that no man should be sad, no child left behind. And instead of talking about each other's arguments, I think there is a point made, David, you touched on it as well, to looking at, well, what do we want to obtain?
Yeah, and I agree completely. And I was also thinking it's really interesting what you said, Asha, about the reactive response versus the proactive response. And I think that's a very important point as well in dealing with these issues, that we need to figure out some way of not having this, as Christian calls it, the trench war, but finding some common ground where we can work together on, well, this is actually the common goal we have, and we want to all work together to reach it.
Great, thank you. So how about you, Asha? What did you take with you from this presentations?
Thank you. Like I said at the beginning of my presentation, it was good to have a kind of in-depth dive into the kind of angry male persona online, and I've had the benefit and fortune to work with David before, and we actually worked together on quite a lot of this back in 2018 when we were seeing what was happening in Bulgaria, particularly around the Istanbul Convention. So it's great to see what's been analysed since then. And understanding what the consequences have been in society and how normalized some of those conversations have become amongst what I guess you would call the movable middle, as it were, the people who may not have known about these issues before, but now seemingly have a level of expertise or understanding, or at least an opinion on something that they may not have been aware of before. So it was good to have that like a dive at a national level as well.
Great. So, and David, have you got something from Christian, Stine, and Asha? Something that stays in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said in the beginning of my presentation, I'm absolutely fascinated by the analysis of Christian and Stine. I think this is a very, very, very important perspective. As I was listening to them, I was thinking about some of my friends who boys who are not that radical, but are still expressing some of the things that you mentioned in your analysis. So really have to we have to look at it and stay close to your recommendations. And yeah, thank you very much for that.
Great, David. Thank you very much. Okay, so now that we had some kind of reactions to each other, I just want to go straight away to the questions from our attendees. So you actually got Christian Sina, you got the questions from Valentin. Thank you so much for this research. How did you manage to keep the resilience? Because I assume it could be psychological challenging sometimes doing that, what you did.
We had lots of talks about the psychological underpinnings. Like, yeah, it is emotionally tasking, because if you spend 10 hours a day listening to, or at least lending creed to some of these arguments, at some point you're going to take it home with you. So we used each other a lot and used our local team a lot. We also had a folder on a shared network drive filled with eye bleach. So happy pictures of baby animals that we could go look at, and just like happy picture input, because otherwise it is scary. And one coping mechanism as well was to take some of the extreme points, usually about female genitalia, and make fun of them. Like, at some point you just need to like take it down a notch and listen to arguments about what happens to women's bodies once they hit puberty, and just be like, all right, so there's also this stuff. So like, take it down a notch.
Yeah, and I think what was really interesting when we were looking at all these sites and comments and listening to these people is there's this sort of numbing effect created where you get used to what you're seeing. And I find that really interesting, because that also means that the people who populate these communities, they also get numb to it. And then this explains why it gets more and more extreme and more boundary seeking. Because I mean, if I spend half a year just looking at these comments and I get numb by just doing that a couple hours a day, then what happens if you spend most of your free time in these communities?
Yeah, it's sort of like taking a shower, and then at some point you keep on turning up the hot water because it doesn't feel hot anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that picture. So we have another question here for all the panelists. Do you think that faith or religion have a positive or negative impact on concept of masculinity? It's kind of broad, but maybe Asha can start. What do you think about the faith or religion?
I think it's just to put it in the context of what we've seen, and I want to pick up on some of the elements that David mentioned in his presentation, because what we saw, what we continue to see, is that this is being framed as an alignment to traditional or religious values, and so they are being attacked by these feminist movements. They are being attacked by human rights movements. And so, of course, everyone has the freedom and the right to religion and to perform their religion. So it's how it's being framed, which I think is at the crux of this issue. I think, of course, we can talk about the varied aspects in regards to certain values or aspects that seek traditional roles for women, men, boys, girls, within those particular contexts. But I think framing here is so important, and looking at things as a polarized existence. For me, I am a massive fan of nuance, a huge fan of nuance, because I feel that there are many complex issues where the nuance has been removed and the complexity of it has been removed, based on the fact that we're having these conversations in the online space, and things are reduced and things are put down to very short, communicative, snappy ways. And actually, we're talking about extremely complex topics that have a lot of different facets that come into it. And so that being removed from it means it's become easier to become polarized. And this kind of online tribalism has happened. So me as a Black woman who's also an active feminist and works in this space, I've experienced this a lot myself online. It's one of the reasons I went into that online space. And despite my respect for everybody's freedoms, it has been positioned in sometimes that I don't respect people's religious or traditional freedoms, when that's not the case. It's a case of, let's have a conversation and talk about things in a collective way, rather than becoming more and more polarized.
Okay, great. So I think we're actually getting into this because I would love us to put the last 10 minutes on what we can do. And this, and I mean, all of you kind of pointed out some positive stuff, something that we actually can do to kind of, to work against this vicious cycle that it starts. So yeah, and you have different responses to that. But if we would like to see each other as allies and as maybe what do you call it, like a country, what do you call it, a country counter culture to the counterculture. I don't know, maybe if you can say that. So what would you say could be the steps forward for us to work with this and to try? I mean, you've already said some stuff specifically, but I would like to know on a structural level and individual level, maybe on group level and so on. Please.
I think one of the things that we've been trying to promote is the opposite of mute culture and the opposite of mute strategies, especially with the younger boys and men that we talk to. They all expressed a level of annoyance or psychological discrepancy from not being allowed to have certain conversations. When boys and men aged 16, 17, 18, whatever, would try to start a conversation that all women are evil because I'm treated like this. Usually they said that they were met with the argument, no, women are not evil, therefore we should not have this conversation. Then the conversation is nullified. But what we've been trying to promote is that, well, we don't need to recognize the argument or the premise, but we do need to recognize the emotionality behind it. So instead of hearing that all women are evil, well, why do you say that? And usually if you're the closest or the closest professional or closest adult, you would know the man in question saying so, and you would have a pretty good idea, like, why is it exactly you who is saying that? Why is it you who's saying that today? And so there's a conversation to be had. And if we don't want to entertain the premise or the argument that all women are evil or all women should be cleansed, whatever, well, at least we need to explain why not and which conversation we would then have.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, it's also a question of creating a space, creating a room where it's okay to just be you, to just be the person you are, where I want to listen to you. I might not agree with you, but I want to listen to you no matter who you are. And where the masculinity ideal is much broader than it is right now. It's very rigid, it's very narrow at the moment. So it's a question of creating a space where there's room and where it's okay to be a young, sad, miserable, lonely person, because I'm here to help you. I want to listen to you, even though your points of view might be controversial comparing to mine, but I still want to listen to you and get to the bottom of why are you feeling this way? Why are you sad?
So do you have anything to add, David and Asha?
Yes, I would be happy to, although Stine already mentioned it, I think it's very important to open space for those young men to be who they are, and to feel so heard and recognized. This is very important, and also I think this is a part of work that should be done on different levels, because this can be done at grassroots level, but we also have to think of effective communication campaigns. And I believe that Men Engage Europe and Men Engage Global Alliance can play a really crucial role in sending positive messages and countering the backlash.
Okay. Asha, please.
Yeah, just to add on, I think it's always imperative to remember that it's about systems change. And sometimes we need to consider the language that we're using when we're talking about this. So maybe to pick up on the example that was given, even the term patriarchy, I have seen people in the online space who do not have a radical perspective get immediately switched off when they hear the word patriarchy. And it's I find it as part of my job, and I guess as many of you, to explain that patriarchy impacts us all negatively. The concept of what a man should be, the gender stereotypes that we see come from that as well. It is not just talking about, this very specific oppression of women. Of course, that's what we focus on, but understanding that it's a negative for all of us in this situation. So this is where I would agree on how we effectively communicate, how we make visible stories, because as we saw, Me Too was incredibly powerful, and that was about sharing stories, but also remembering what the internet, and to go from my expertise, what the internet was designed for, that freedom of communication, that freedom of expression, that freedom of information exchange, and trying to recapture that and use it as a tool that many civil society have to depend on because it's a free tool, to be able to capture the feeling of the need for change. What is common, I think, amongst all these different groups is that there's either something is changing or there is a feel that something needs to change. How can we capture that collectively and make a change that benefits all of us?
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to be a bit provocative now, maybe, but I mean, if we have lots of youth centers and youth counseling, we have lots of like structure in our. I come from the Nordic countries perspectives, but I think it's somewhat similar in the rest of Europe as well. Maybe less in some countries and so. But there is like an infrastructure where we are open to get young people and especially young men to talk. And I know in the area of Sweden, for example, I know it's only like one of the fifth meetings are where boys are being met with those questions. Like only 20%, even less, of all the counseling there is going on is with young guys. So and then the picture that Stine Christian, you tell us that there is lots of conversations going on those issues. So I would just like to ask, so what are we doing wrong, like in the structural level, but maybe also us, like maybe feminist and pro-feminist organizations that are actually providing some of those online chats and so on. But we are like, why are we lagging behind? What are we doing wrong?
Well, first of all, if you ask me how I'm doing, well, I'm fine. I do not have a problem. I think most men my age, I'm 33, can recognize that the scenario where you are like in the last hours of a party, 2, 3, 4 in the morning, you're on your way home, you're sharing a kebab, something with your best friend. That is the point where someone will say, actually, I'm not fine. So you need to have like 8, 9 hours of binge drinking until someone you're close with, your friend through 20 years will open up and say, actually, I'm not fine. I'm really much not fine, because then you can pretend to have forgotten it the next day. And that's with me and my friends who are like sort of emotionally stable. And then take a 16-year-old boy who is not emotionally stable, who is not having any faith in systems. Like that is what you're trained to when you're 16, 17, 18 years old. You're listening to Rage Against the Machine. You're trying to tear down society. You're trying to rebuild stuff. You don't believe it when someone is saying, I want to help you. And couple that with the fact that you are trying to convince the world that you don't have any problems, that you are invulnerable, you are invincible and 10 feet tall, then it's a really hard conversation to start. First of all, I think it's something that when we talk about emotionally empowering young men, it's also about not accepting the I'm fine. Like you follow it up with, are you though? Because you look like shit. Like that is a very fair perspective to do it. And also to there's an NGO in Denmark called Sex og Samfund, Sex and Society, who is in this week promoting a campaign of telling boys and girls what they are also, like women as police officers, boys as vulnerable, boys as fighters, as well as anything else in between. So I think it starts from a very early age, because right now there is, like Stine talked about, a safety in then identifying as the resistance movement, as the victims of society. You identify as an incel, or you identify as something. And most interviews we've had has been on the crux of them trying to convince us that we were wrong. And then halfway through, they sort of find the catharsis in explaining how they are actually feeling. So even for us, it's super hard. But our takeaways, because we're a digital organization, anonymize it, give the boys a safe, anonymous digital space where they live, where they don't have to put themselves in a place of being vulnerable.
Yeah, I agree. But I also think it's a question of, as I said before, breaking down these stereotypes we have. And it starts much earlier than offering counseling. Of course, it's a very important thing to have places for them to go and to offer counseling to them. But it starts, as far as I'm concerned, much earlier. It's a question of, in kindergarten, in preschool, you need to teach these kids that, well, you might be a boy and you might be a girl, but that doesn't mean there are things you can and cannot do due to your gender, that you have equal opportunities, and you have your emotional life is just as meaningful as the other guy's is. It's a question of breaking this down very early and teaching the kids, well, you're all right. You can be sad even though you're a boy. You can be tough even though you're a girl, and creating a different narrative around it.
Great, thank you very much. So please, last add on, Asha and David, before we're already behind the schedule, but please, some last comments before we round up. David or Asha, who wants to start? Nobody wants to start. David wants to start.
Thank you. Thank you, Asha. Well, I just want to say that I saw in the Q&A section there are a lot of questions, and I hope we can find a way to provide answers to them, even though we don't have time now. It was very, very interesting for me to take part in this, and I'm happy that we are moving forward in terms of getting to know what really concerns people like the angrier men.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much, and thank you for your cooperation here. Asha, please.
Yes, to echo David, thank you so much for the interesting discussion. To pick up on the last point by Stina and Christian, comprehensive sexuality education. That's what I would say, because comprehensive sexuality education isn't just about the sexuality education that we may have been subjected to as children, but also about citizenship. What do safe relationships look like? What does bodily autonomy look like? And also breaking down gender stereotypes and talking from a perspective of, you're a boy, so you have to do this, or you have the option to break those boundaries yourself, but to eradicate those boundaries to begin with. They don't exist. And that's at the heart of comprehensive sexuality education. So thank you.
Thank you, Asha. Well, and as a sexual educator, as I am actually, I would say amen and mashallah and everything. Thank you very much, everybody. And I just want to, before we go, I just want to see, I'm going to do the polling. I really like to do the polling. So I just want to see what the people feel right now, not that we are finishing. So please tell us how you're feeling right now before we close for this day. And as this is a Men Engage global Ubuntu Symposium event, but also in cooperation with Men Engage Europe Network. And we have a membership meeting, and we will go on talking on this subjects. And next week, we'll actually have a workshop with the Men Engage Europe members on this subject. And you can see this on the Ubuntu Symposium app. After a while, we will have this video on, so you can rewatch it and watch it again if you want to. So thank you very much for voting. We have 62% voted. Come on, please get up to 70 maybe, so I can share it, please. Thank you very much. Yeah, we're almost there. Okay, so I'm ending the poll now, just in 2 seconds. Yes. Okay, here you go. And these are the results. We don't have any angry people anymore. Woohoo, that's good. And most of the people are excited, and we have lots of people are curious and happy. Some really, and some of them are hungry too. I can understand it's actually lunchtime here. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the panelists for this. We really hope that we can work together on this. And good luck with your wonderful work that you do. Okay, so thank you. Have a good one.